welcome back to 5-Minute Bible Study. Today we are back in the book of Jonah. Our passage of scripture comes from Jonah chapter 1, verses 14 through 16. Let's read these verses together. Verse 14 says, "So they called out to the Lord, 'Please, Lord, don't let us perish because of this man's life, and don't charge us with innocent blood. For you, Lord, have done just as you please.' Then they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. The men were seized by great fear of the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows." So let's recap for a second. So far in Jonah, we saw the sovereign God at work in the life of Jonah. The Lord told Jonah to arise and go to this great city of Nineveh to preach against its wicked ways. However, Jonah disobeyed the Lord's command and fled to Tarsus on a cargo ship, and thus fleeing from the Lord's presence. We then see how God caused this great storm to come upon Jonah. The sailors on this ship began to call out to their gods and threw the ship's cargo overboard. Jonah knew the storm was due to his rebellion and offered himself as a sacrifice to appease the Lord's wrath. So now in our passage of scripture today, we see these Gentile sailors begin to acknowledge the sovereign Lord who made the sea and dry land. So right off the gate, these pagan sailors began to call out to the Lord here in verse 14. Notice how they address God. They address him by saying Yahweh, which is the divine name for God. They identify that Jonah's God is the one who caused all of this to transpire. They began to call out to Yahweh, and the prayer is for Yahweh to express compassion and mercy towards them for the task that they are about to endure. They feared the Lord's vengeance for Jonah's death after he is fed into the sea. These sailors knew there are consequences for murder, especially the death of God's servant. So at the end of the prayer, these sailors accredited the power to the sovereign God. The latter part of verse 14 says, "For you, Lord, have done just as you pleased." These sailors understood who God is before God did anything for them. In short, they feared the Lord for who he is, not what he can give them. So now in verse 15, these sailors hurled Jonah into the sea, just like they hurled the ship's cargo in verse 5. However, unlike the cargo, when they hurled Jonah into the sea immediately ceased from its raging. The chapter ends with the sailors fearing with great fear of Yahweh. They feared God and all he is, and began to offer a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Just like the disciples after Jesus calmed the sea from last week, these sailors feared the one who even the wind and the storm obey. So now, let's pretend for a moment. Let's pretend you are an Israelite reading this narrative for the very first time. You can relate with the character of Jonah since he too is an Israelite. However, you see the sinfulness in Jonah's behavior in running away from the Lord's presence. In an unprecedented way, you see God's judgment placed on Jonah rather than on these Gentile sailors. This ought to humble you, for anyone can act sinfully as Jonah did and deserving God's judgment. God showed mercy towards these sailors, and they began to worship him. This event sets up the rest of the book for what God is going to do later on to these Ninevites. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.